now, no? Since it was initiated, and that is a focus on questions of debt, the IMF, and the related political and social impacts of both debt, sovereign debt, the sovereign debt crisis, as well as the so-called response to it in the form of the IMF program and the debt restructuring processes initiated by the previous government and currently being continued by the new one. So YUKTHI is a informal collective. It's not a organization, it's a platform, and it brings together people who are working in different organizations as well as individuals, different kinds of people too. And the idea was to try to bring our voices together, to amplify them, and to make critical intervention in what was a monochrome discourse or dialogue here in Sri Lanka, one which was absolutely accepting of the IMF program and its framework, one which assumed that the only way to proceed is because they're experts and we are not. So the aim of this panel is to sort of come to the problem in a different way, and that is by sort of looking again critically at law or legal processes, standards, legal institutions, mechanisms. And really, it's a delight to have the panel that we do. And let me just quickly say, what they will be talking about and how it sort of fits together. So we're going to hear first from Namashya Rathnayaka, and she will be speaking really from the coal face, sort of speaking about how post 2022, so even before the IMF program, but through it now as it continues, uh, we are seeing, we see also attacks on, so challenges to protect people's rights, but also assaults and attacks on people's rights. And of course, both these are in the arena of law. Both invoke the law in their own ways. So Namashya, who has been directly involved in some of these battles, in some of these struggles, uh, wearing while the rest of us outside. She's going to talk to us a little bit about what's been happening, how it's been happening. She's going to look at it through the prism of public law, and she's going to give us some insights into that process. Namashya will then be followed by Deepika Udagama, professor of law at Peradeniya University, and she will sort of in some ways situate this within a larger picture, a bigger picture, which is one of constitutionalism, of constitutional governance, of a sort of the relationship between the state and people, or state and citizens. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the ways in which we could begin to think about also issues around accountability, but also combating or resisting authoritarianism, and how we respond to austerity too. But coming from a perspective of where we can find ways to strengthen people's rights in this process, or to make clear these other obligations, the obligations that always get forgotten, the obligations that a state owes to its citizens, including when we are in a sovereign debt crisis. And Deepika will be followed, joining us from Germany, and we're very pleased. It's still early in the morning, but thank you so much. We have Kristina Rehbein, and she will be joining us from Jubilee, Germany. She's a debt justice campaigner. She's been following events in Sri Lanka very closely. She's been here, she was here with us also this year. And she continues to work with campaigners here. And she will be talking to us about how some of these things are unfolding on an international legal plane. She'll be talking to us a little bit about what happens there, some of the debates that are going on there. And again, trying to see where we can find openings or ways in which try to use the law in ways, as I said, that resist austerity, that resist authoritarianism, and that try to realize greater accountability from states, from creditors, from international financial institutions, for people's rights, for people's social, economic, and political rights, all of which have been under assault in this country as well as elsewhere through this time. So now what I'm going to do is to just go and help maybe facilitate the movement of the slides, and we'll hear from Namashya for about 20 minutes, not too much more, and I'll sort of prompt you when we're getting nearer the time limit.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kumar. First, I want to thank BCIS for actually having us and hosting this discussion. And of course, I find it a great privilege and honor to speak in a panel that consists of other experts in their own respective fields who have a wealth of experience. With that, I just want to preface everything that I'm going to say with the fact that I'm saying this in my experience as a junior counsel and a researcher, and it continues to be a learning curve for me. So I am more than willing to hear if there is a different perspective, to make sure that this discussion at the end of it becomes a shared learning experience for all of us. So when I was asked to speak, I thought I will use this opportunity to actually speak about three main things. Firstly, in general, on what the IMF discourse is like and what the space is for issues on authoritarianism and accountability. Where is the room in that discourse for these concepts? And then on to specific developments that we have been seeing and which has been problematic, which is to do with the debt restructuring that has been happening under the IMF program, specifically in relation to domestic debt restructuring, and then thereafter the legislative the lawmaking processes that have been happening under this IMF 17 program. So to start with the IMF 17 discourse, we see that when we talk about IMF 17, it's very economic focus. The mainstream discourse is very narrowly focused on economics, which is numbers, principles, and statistics, which the ordinary person might not be fully familiar with. But it's important to know that when we go and ask for IMF support, the countries actually ask, when the IMF support will come with certain conditionalities. Conditionalities that will fundamentally alter how we and what our relationship with the state is. And what I mean by this is IMF will give us conditionalities to do with maybe taxes, to do with welfare, to do with pensions, to do with utilities. And this will change how what our relationship is with the state. So because of that, this does raise big public law issues as well that go beyond just the question of economics. We have to think about things like democracy, rule of law. We have to think about things, the constitutional values that we have as well. Because once again, the contract that we have with the government really overrides the contract that the government has with the IMF. So what do we mean by when we say the contract that we have with the state rather? This is, I know it sounds a bit abstract, but we do have some guidance. If you look at our constitution, we have a chapter on directive principles of state policy that's supposed to guide the president, the parliament, and the cabinet of ministers when they bring in policies in our country. And some of these specifically say that the state has to promote social welfare. The state has to have institutions that are guided by political, economic, and social justice. So there are certain promises that the state has made to its people through our constitution. And we need to hold the government accountable to those, the state accountable to those promises, which is why it's important to have maybe discussions like this and talk about these public law questions. So on screen are some of these questions that we can be asking, whether something's reasonable, rational, is it based on some evidence, who bears the costs and benefits, is it transparent, etc. But I'll raise these questions in particular in relation to the two examples that I want to raise. First, in relation to domestic debt restructuring, which we will maybe go to. So domestic debt restructuring is one of those typical examples of something that's very economics oriented and something that we don't really understand. But it's important to talk about this because it raises these questions that I previously spoke about. So how does domestic debt restructuring fit into IMF 70? So IMF wants Sri Lanka's debt to be sustainable. And by this, broadly, what it means is making sure that our present and future obligations on debt can be paid without us falling into a default. So this is IMF's goal, right? So to reach that, we have decided that we are going to engage in something called debt restructuring. So what is debt restructuring? Debt restructuring is basically where the government decides that they are going to now negotiate with its creditors who gave them all their money to maybe negotiate the terms of the original agreement that they had when they got the money. So it might be that the government might negotiate with them to say, we need a little bit longer amount of time to pay the money that we took. Or the government might say, maybe we can't pay the originally agreed interest amount. We need to cut that down. Or the government might say, we can't actually pay the full amount that we got. Maybe we'll pay parts of it that is agreeable to you. So inevitably what happens in this process is that the creditor will bear some loss. So for a long time, when we hit our crisis, we were given assurances, specifically from the period of April to August 2022, that the IMF will not restructure domestic debt. These assurances were publicly given. And why is this assurance of not restructuring domestic debt important? Because if we look at the composition of who holds the domestic debt, we see that the working people of Sri Lanka also holds the domestic debt. And how does that happen? Because if you look at the domestic creditors, how the government gets its part of how it gets its money is it's going to issue bonds for securities, for example, like treasury bonds or treasury bills. These will be purchased by creditors. These could be banks. These could be, for instance, private creditors, but this also includes the EPF. And what is the EPF? The EPF is basically the pension fund of a certain category of workers, including all private sector workers. So when this fund was created in the 1950s, it was specifically created to protect the working people of Sri Lanka because they didn't have any insurance scheme or social safety in that sense. And when they retired, a female at 50 and a male at 55, they would get all the retirement funds that were saved, which is basically money that's given by themselves in terms of whatever the allowance that they or salary that they get, as well as the money that has been contributed to by employees. So this is the money that they hold and they are supposed to get. And in fact, it includes also people who are like government sector workers, private sector, the plantation sector workers, factory workers. And if you look at the debates on the EPF, we see that Parliament actually wanted to specifically protect them because they saw white collar workers already had private pension schemes. So when when the government gave us this assurance that they are not going to restructure domestic debt, in other words, they were giving that assurance to the working people that their money will not be touched. We know you invested in us, but you will get your returns. That's the assurance that they're giving. And interestingly, this coincided when with when Aragale was taking place, when people were extremely frustrated and when we were at the peak of the economic crisis, people were on the streets and asking for a system change when these assurances came. But then, after almost a year after, we see that the economic crisis as we know it, or as an ordinary person would understand, would feel like it's almost over. We don't really need to go to the streets because we don't suffer from long power outages, right? So because of what happened with people thinking that the economic crisis is now okay and now the economy has already been stabilized, the government changed its position. The central bank said that they will actually be going into domestic debt restructuring. And in fact, so how this happened was the governor gave a proposal to the parliament and said, this is my plan to restructure domestic debt in our country. So when the governor said that, it was extremely concerning because this plan targeted almost exclusively the EPF. So the EPF was then, according to this plan, supposed to take the cut of debt restructuring. So the governor presented this to the parliament on the 28th of June, just a few days after. As you can see on the screen, on the 1st of July, parliament decided that they're going to pass this through a resolution, and they did that. And within 3 months, they took everything, all the measures that they needed to make sure that this deal went through. They made the necessary changes in the legislation that they wanted to. And this deal was closed on the 12th of September 2023. So what basically happened was the government initiated its domestic debt restructuring process. It targeted the EPF, and the EPF, the debt that was owed to EPF was the debt that was taking the cut. So what happened was the interest rates then reduced from 20% to 12% and then 9% from 2025 onwards. We still don't have information as to what exactly this loss that was caused to a given person in the EPF is, because this information has not been made available by the government. But we do have estimates that have been made by independent experts who say that people have lost about 50% of the original savings that they were supposed to get from the EPF because of this deal. So just to raise some of the key concerns on this restructuring. I think any person would have already understood that this targeting and the process is clearly problematic. So one of the first problems with this in a public law perspective is we know when a government takes a decision, it takes it in public trust. It has to have a certain justification to why it's taking these decisions. Because like I said, our constitution has certain values that they need to try and uphold. So when they took this debt restructuring decision, there was no evidence-based justification that they gave to why domestic debt restructuring had to be initiated at that particular point of time and also be concluded that fast when external debt restructuring was still happening, right? And secondly, why did they want to target the EPF by excluding the other domestic creditors who have also purchased these treasury bonds, which include banks and um, the private creditors? And in fact, we are the only country who have exclusively targeted our pension funds. So, which was clearly discriminatory and raises questions on how is the government really viewing the EPF? Is it viewing it as people's money, or is it just a static pot of cash that's available for the government to use because it's under its control, which people might not really understand was used, because this is about the future earnings that they were going to get, right? This is an investment that they made, but they're not getting the originally agreed interest rate. So people would only realize that they might not be getting the money that they want only at the time of retirement. And even then, we don't really know if an ordinary person would understand this, because that kind of information or what they are losing out was never really told and explained to them. So another issue, a very big issue with the transaction, was the conflict of interest that was associated with this deal. So when the government goes and negotiates its debt, like I previously mentioned, there is the government sitting at the negotiating table, like we see with the external creditors. They then discuss it with the creditors and come into an agreeable deal. And in fact, we know when we negotiate with external creditors, we pay billions for financial advisors and legal advisors to sit at that table to make sure we get the best deal. But when this deal went through, the people who offered the deal was the government. And we know this, it's a central bank, the governor who gave in the proposal. But who is taking the decision for the EPF? By law, the custodian of the EPF is the monetary board of the central bank, which the chairman of which is the governor of the central bank. So we see the person who's making the offer is the central bank. The person who is actually accepting the offer and saying this is a good offer or this is what we accept is also the monetary bank. Clear conflict of interest in this transaction. And this is problematic because we don't know if the monetary board actually took into account the working people's interest in this transaction, or whether they only took into account the interests of the government in reaching those IMF targets. And we still, after the deal was closed, we still don't know this information because we don't know what went through in that monetary board decision-making process. And that brings me to my final point to say that there was no transparency. There was no not at the point of decision making, not at the point of people participating in this, and not even after this transaction. And we know now the deal went through, and who is taking the cut of this? The working people of Sri Lanka. So I have a couple of ideas for way forward, but in the interest of time, I am just, maybe we can leave it for Q&A if we have time. But this is about how do we protect the EPF from further abuse, because the EPF has been historically abused. This is not the first time that this is happening. But also, how do we build principles when we enter into domestic debt restructuring to make sure that the most politically powerful parties don't use their leverage to actually pass on that burden to the voiceless people who might have to also engage in this domestic debt restructuring. So things like transparency, impartiality, legitimacy, values that they try to incorporate in external debt restructuring exchanges need to come into domestic debt restructuring as well. So moving to the second development that I want to speak about. And this is on the legislative mechanisms that have been pushed forward by this government. So under IMF 17, we've seen like a never before seen trend of law after law after law being proposed and passed in parliament. And how do these laws come about, and why are these connected to IMF 17? So part of these laws are actually in what is colloquially termed as that IMF agreement, the staff level agreement that the government went and agreed to. So if you look at the people who make this commitment, it is a letter that is written by the Minister of Finance and the governor of the central bank, writing to the managing director of the IMF, saying we will be doing these things in our country, so give us your financial support. So of the things that the executive has gone and promised to the IMF managing director are all these laws. And these are the laws that we saw later, some of them being proposed and passed already, but some of them just being at bill stage at the moment. But there is also other connected legislation. This is not there in the staff agreement in word, but the government said that they want to have these laws because they want to reach the IMF targets or what the IMF is saying. So they are connected legislation. For example, especially the Economic Transformation Act, which installs and which puts into law the IMF targets as well and installs a certain liberal economic model, but without the social protections that we need to mitigate those risks that might arise if we go in that model, which has already been recognized by the liberals themselves. But there is also another category of legislation that came about, which were dissent restricting. So these legislation basically allowed the executive to concentrate power in its hands and sort of try to not tried, but also creates actual risks to legitimate exercise of freedom of expression. And some of you all might already have heard of this, a prime example being the Online Safety Act. So what are the concerns that are raised in this process? One thing that we have to seriously start thinking about is about our institutions and how democratic they are. For example, how can the executive go and promise to the IMF that they will pass a certain law at this particular time with the time frames when the lawmaking is actually done by parliament? It's not the executive's realm to go and make those promises. The IMF sees Sri Lanka as one state, as like a monolithic entity. But within Sri Lanka, we have a constitution, we have a separation of powers where each branch is intentionally separated and given different responsibilities. So that's the other thing about the executive is it's the concentration of power that the executive is getting through those dissent restricting legislation and thoughts about how democratic that is. But also we need to think about the parliament. When it comes to lawmaking, is it okay for the parliament? Now, if you look at the screen, you see, for instance, the Economic Transformation Bill. This was gazetted on the 14th of May 2024 and passed on 9th August 2024. Within just few months, they proposed a law. When it was gazetted is when the ordinary citizen first gets to know about it. They proposed a law and they passed it, and which changed the entire, which literally by the name says economic transformation, without us knowing anything about it. So is that kind of lawmaking process democratic, or is it leaning towards more authoritarian? And also another question that we should think about is the parliament is actually choosing which commitments to implement and the time of which commitments to go ahead with and which commitments to maybe do later or not do at all. For example, if you look at the taxes that were imposed, we see when the value added tax was recommended by the IMF, that was imposed. And when that was imposed, we know this is an indirect tax. So everyone suffers. Even the poorest of the person will find goods and services expensive. But if you look at wealth taxes, and wealth taxes have been asked by the IMF, we still haven't heard anything about it. So clearly the parliament is choosing which laws it wants to impose, pass, and which laws it maybe it won't. And then this raises questions about the intentions of parliament and how democratic and how people oriented their working is. And also other questions on transparency and citizen engagement. As I said, these laws have immediately been proposed and immediately been passed. And whenever the citizens had the chance, they have actually challenged. A lot of these laws have been challenged in the Supreme Court. And this shows that the citizens want to engage with this process. And we can't really consider this an effective forum of engagement because the ordinary citizen can only challenge a law when it's been placed in parliament and they have 14 days to do it according to the constitution. So how can we even possibly understand a law within 14 days and actually raise these concerns to court? And moreover, the court can only actually look at constitutionality. They will look at the constitution, see if these laws are inconsistent and say it is inconsistent. But court can't even ask the government to strike it down. The government can go ahead with those laws anyway, based on how the constitution is made. Maybe incorporating some of the amendments that the Supreme Court is suggesting. So all of the amendments they are bound to, but these amendments don't necessarily mean that these laws match the ground realities of the working people. So a law can still be a good law based on theory, but if it doesn't help people, and it in fact when it is implemented hurts people on the ground, it is not a good law. And this forum to engage is not a good enough forum for people to engage during that time. So what are the ideas that I want to maybe for us to think about, especially with this parliament coming into being and maybe them talking about a new constitution? We have to seriously start thinking about how we make our laws, because it needs to be a more consultative process. It needs to take time, think of what people actually need, because the government is accountable to the people and not the IMF, right? And we can also think about socioeconomic rights, which are not really in the constitution as justiciable rights. Meaning, if our right to housing, our right to food was violated, we can't really go to court and say our fundamental right was violated. So we can think of incorporating this into our constitution. And also, most importantly, Sri Lanka is now stuck with all of these laws that the parliament only can repeal. And we know that takes a lot of political will. So how do we now, the court cannot intervene because we don't have post-enactment judicial review. So once a law is passed, you can't take it to court and say this is a bad law. So we can maybe incorporate post-enactment judicial review in a possible constitution if that ever becomes a reality. So these are my thoughts for now, but I'm happy to engage during the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And wasn't that a great way to begin this panel? And you can see we've only more and more namashyas. Yes, thank you. I want to, I'm sorry that it's my fault. You know, I was very strict and I said, you know, you can't have more than 5 slides. So what you saw was that Namashya had to squeeze in all of this legislation. And actually what's actually important is not to know the names, but just to see the sheer volume. That's what that's what Namashya also wants you to take away from this. And I mean, understand within, this is under 2 years. This is in less than 24 months. All of this legislation is rushed through, and she's just told us, right, that we're stuck with this, we're settled with this unless Parliament repeals it. As citizens, we can't go and get it struck down because it's unconstitutional, it violates our rights and so on. So thank you so much, Namashya, and I'd like to quickly move on to Professor Deepika Udagama. She has worn many hats. I only introduced her in one of her current incarnations, but you will know that she was a former chair of our Human Rights Commission. But you know, when I first, or maybe first came across her name, it was when Deepika was a special rapporteur for what was then called the Commission on Human Rights. And together with Professor Oloka Onyango, Deepika co-authored, I think it was the very first report from within the human rights system on globalization and its impacts on economic, social, I beg your pardon, on human rights. And one part of that work was to look at international financial institutions. And you looked at the WTO, you also looked at the IMF and the World Bank. This is in the late 1990s. You know, I had that in mind also when I invited Professor Udagama to join this panel. So let's hear from you, and I'll just quickly answer.
Thank you very much, Kumar, and thank you very much to BCIS for, well, thank you to YUKTHI for extending the invitation to me, and for BCIS for putting together this festival of ideas. So I think, you know, I first must congratulate Namashya on a really excellent presentation. She's made my life very easy here. I don't have to say as much as I intended to. So it's really good to know also that the younger generation is more robust and more articulate and, you know, very well informed. That gives us a lot of hope. So, I mean, she's covered a lot of ground that I wanted to address, but what I just wish to point to is that in terms of negotiations, that country enters into at an international level. So Kumar spoke about international financial institutions and human rights and so on. We know that the World Bank and the IMF they do not consider themselves to be bound by the international human rights framework. They do not consider themselves to be, bound by international human rights framework. But there's the other side of it, because it's states that negotiate with them, states that enter into agreements with international financial institutions, and their story is very different because they are bound by their domestic constitutional systems, more than the legislative, the constitutional systems. So one of the things is that when a country doesn't have very strong democratic institutions or traditions, states, meaning governments representing the state, feel they have complete liberty to go and negotiate any way they want and negotiate away the rights of the people, the rights of a sovereign state and so on. But what we need to keep in mind is that is absolutely not possible. And however, even though a state or a government may think that's a weak point, from their perspective, that's the strength. That's the strength, because any government should be able to should have the gumption to say, well, look, we know we are in trouble, perhaps, not perhaps, very categorically, we are in trouble, and we have a lot to do with it, But now that we are negotiating with you, we also you have to recognize that we cannot transgress our constitution. We cannot violate our constitution. So that in a way is a negotiating trump card, if you're clever about it. But here what happens is most of the time states go and negotiate from start from the premise that we are on a very weak wicket, which is very true. So therefore, we really don't have that bargaining power, which is true. But I think one can be clever about it. So what we have today is that when you look at the advisors who advise government on these negotiations, you don't have the sort of multidisciplinary teams that are required. We really don't see that. So you only have economists, predominantly, I think, economists, or perhaps exclusively economists, advising governments on these negotiations. And that is a mistake. That's an absolute mistake, because governments have to be clever about it. They may not have been very clever about running the economy of a country. That's one thing. Now that they have done the damage and the people are suffering terribly because of that, at least that responsibility they have to, undertake in a very strong and committed manner to say that we can't go beyond this. This is the bottom line. This is what we pointed out in those reports also that we did for the UN subcommission, Kumar. Thanks for reminding, I had forgotten actually, such a long time ago, that states cannot negotiate away fundamental constitutional principles. That's a fact. But there, in terms of how a state feels the necessity to stick to constitutional principles, depends on the strength of civil society, depends on the strength of democratic institutions. So in the Sri Lanka situation, I think when you look at the three organs of government, it's the judiciary, very definitely, which has become a staunch, the staunch supporter of people's rights in this situation. The legislature has, unfortunately, under the executive presidency, always been sort of a rubber stamp. Especially now we talk about majorities. I think it's suicidal to give absolute majorities to any government, to any. Simply because we've got to make sure that the legislature can play its role and have the balance in government, the checks and balances and so on. So now, of course, Sri Lanka as a sovereign state, in terms of external sovereignty, it has every right to go and negotiate internationally. On the other hand, it has negotiated and also entered into international agreements on human rights, environment, and so on. So there are those dimensions that have to be borne in mind. Then domestically, of course, as I pointed out, the Constitution is the main framework for anything. Your external relations and also what you do domestically, it is the supreme law of the land, and that really has to be, the state government has to be reminded all the time. You cannot go beyond this. Now, the judiciary has aided us a lot in the past several decades by developing some absolutely stellar public law concepts. And thanks to young, litigators like you, who really push the envelope, so to speak. So today, it's a very tried principle of law, I would say, that any type of public power, or, state power, is conferred on any state authority to be exercised in the public trust. That means you cannot exercise your public functions, your public powers arbitrarily. They have to be, they should be exercised in a rational and reasonable manner. So of course, it's up to the court to decide whether the state, whether the government has acted in an arbitrary manner or not. But clearly, there are so many judgment after judgment after judgment in environmental law cases, other contexts where the Supreme Court has held the government of the day or the state as represented by the government has violated the public trust doctrine. So we saw this come up in this, what I call the majestic judgment of the Epavala judgment, where the Supreme Court said the state holds all these powers in trust for the people. You can't just whittle them, in a very arbitrary manner. You can't just, sort of give them up. So there the issue was this Epavala phosphate mines. The government of the day had entered into an agreement with a multinational for excavation of the phosphate deposits. And it hadn't even entered, it hadn't even had a environmental impact assessment, EIA. And the Supreme Court, really had, expanded on that and then touched on international environmental law norms, even soft law, what we call soft law, international declarations, not even treaties Sri Lanka has entered into, said that sustainable development is a principle that binds us, and then eventually said, you, the state, you have violated the people's rights by entering into this agreement in an arbitrary manner. You have not discharged your obligations in the public trust. So thereafter we have so many judgments and some absolutely fantastic judgments. Now, another one was the Chunnaham judgment, where the allegation was that the Central Environmental Authority and the Ceylon Electricity Board had entered into an agreement with this private power company to provide power in an area to generate power. And the allegation on the part of environmental groups was that they had, by operating this particular generators and so on, the power generating machinery, contaminated the groundwater. So then the Supreme Court, of course, the main respondents had to be executive or administrative under our constitution. The CEA and the Electricity Board were held liable for violating people's rights. That's equal protection of the law, because they had not really supervised these private power companies' operations, and they haven't conducted the necessary tests and so on and so forth. So there also it was pointed out, you have not exercised your public duties, and you have not used your public powers in accordance with the principle of public trust. Now here, I would say that when Sri Lanka negotiates with IMF, we've got to ask the question, are you exercising your powers under the Constitution to enter into these international agreements by discharging your powers in the public trust? You can't escape it. The government can't say, these are diplomatic talks, these are international talks. Whatever you do, you have to do it under the Constitution. So we only have to have a situation where the courts would be ready to review. Now, unfortunately, recently, the Supreme Court did not give leave to proceed with this petition, which said that in the debt restructuring process, targeting the EPF alone was discriminatory On a technical ground, the court did not give leave to proceed. That's unfortunate. But I think there are possibilities. We have to pursue that nonetheless, deal with the technical issue and go forward. So now in terms of the sort of remedies, now we've got to get to the constitutional framework first. Well, there's Article 1 that I constantly have said, I'm now just finishing something on this. We completely ignore Article 1 of the Constitution. We get to Article 3 immediately. Article 3 says sovereignty of the state lies in the people and includes fundamental rights and the franchise and powers of government. Very important provision. But Article 1 is very important. It frames Article 3 by saying the nature of the state. Can we have the, okay. Sorry, Kumar. I in fact said the directive principles would come first. Okay. It clearly says, Sri Lanka, I don't know why they're putting parentheses Ceylon, like we are not quite sure whether we are Sri Lanka or Ceylon, is a free, sovereign, independent, and democratic socialist republic, and shall be known as the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. It sounds very plain, simple, very descriptive. But, you know, lawyers are, I don't know, masters and mistresses at interpretation. That is the beauty of it, because constitutions are never meant to be static documents. They are meant to be living documents that evolve. And the evolution of these documents come through interpretation. So it's the creativity, basically, of the lawyers. We always commend the judges for that. And of course, you know, the judges are finally the arbiters of the law. But it's, you know, the creativity of lawyers who go before courts and argue these cases, that's absolutely essential. So when you look at it from that perspective, this phrase, Democratic Socialist Republic, is absolutely key. What does democratic socialist mean? What does it really mean? Now that is explicated in this chapter on directive principles of state policy. In 27.2, it says the state is pledged to establish Sri Lanka a democratic socialist society, the objectives of which include, and it lists so many things, which includes the full realization of the fundamental rights and freedoms of all persons, the promotion of the welfare, the promotion of the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political, shall guide all the institutions of national life. Then the realization by all citizens of an adequate standard of living. This is the key. For themselves and their families, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, the continuous improvement of living conditions, and the full enjoyment of leisure and social and cultural opportunities. That's wonderful. You know why they wax eloquent in these sections? Because they are considered to be non-justiciable, meaning that you can't use these provisions before a court of law to seek redress. But lawyers have found a way out, and the judiciary has assisted by giving excellent judgments. So now, for example, Article 27C, 2C, the realization by all citizens of an adequate standard of living has been used by the court in a situation, in a context where, as was pointed out by Namashya, we don't have strong economic and social rights, guarantees in the fundamental rights chapter. Now, we should know as citizens the contradictions here. On the one hand, at a political level, our governors, people who govern the country, public representatives would say, we are a third world country, we are a developing country, and economic and social rights are more important than civil and political rights. That's a rhetoric. That is called the full belly theory, right? We have to fill the stomachs of our people before we think of freedom of expression and so on. But what do you find in the constitutions? Civil and political rights. So right to education, right to housing, as you pointed out, right to healthcare, right to transportation, social security, etc., are not expressly guaranteed as fundamental rights in the Constitution. Now, there is a movement, however, which is now several decades old, where especially India, I would say, through this, what we call public interest litigation, has through judicial interpretation exponentially developed economic and read in to the fundamental rights chapter, economic and social rights. So the right to education was first introduced through interpretation, but now by later amendment, Indian Parliament included that in the chapter on fundamental rights. So emergency health care, livelihood is a huge concept there. Right to life includes livelihood. So now we have this tradition of interpreting civil and political rights to also include economic and social rights. Now, our courts have used this, the realization by all citizens of an adequate standard of living, read together with the fundamental rights chapter is now considered to be a remedy giving formula. So you find in the Chunnaham judgment, the issue was access to clean drinking water because the water table was polluted by this private electricity generating company. And the court said, you can't say that people's rights are not violated by this because an adequate standard of living includes access to clean drinking water. That read together with Article 12.1, which is about equal protection of the law, the court said is sufficient. And so the court found that the Central Environmental Authority and the Ceylon Electricity Board had violated the equal protection law clause of the Constitution by bringing in the directive principles of state policy. In many ways now, the states can't hide behind these arguments any longer. And, decades ago, I remember when I came back, having completed my postgraduate studies, when you spoke about economic and social rights, you were looked upon as a freak. What's that? You can't put those in constitutions. You need a lot of funds. You need a lot of resources to have economic and social rights. And the debate went on like that. Even very progressive elements would say those don't belong in constitutions. But today, that is completely different. The discourse has developed. Our understanding of international human rights law has developed. International law itself has developed so much that we know states can't hide behind these arguments that, economic and social rights are not rights. They require a lot of funds. Civil and political rights are very different because they only require a state to have negative obligations, that is to say not to act, not to violate freedom of expression, etc. Whereas economic and social rights bring about positive obligations. The states have to spend, build structures. So if you look at the right to education, state will have to build schools, we'll have to train teachers, we'll have to develop curricula, we'll have to ensure students have access to education, etc. So those arguments were raised. But we know even civil and political rights require a lot of funds. If you look at the administration of justice system, my God, it costs billions to have courts, to have court officials, to appoint judges, to train them, to have court officials, to have prisons, to have law enforcement. It costs a lot. The most expensive right, I would say, is the right to justice, if I may use the term, and the other is franchise. Very expensive. Would we do away with those because they're costly? We'd say, no, go and beg and borrow, bring the money, have elections. So similarly, why not schooling, housing? Those are the lifelines for national life. So we need them in the Constitution. So that is absolutely a must. Anyway, we can't run away from it because Sri Lanka has ratified a good many international human rights treaties. We need to know this. In fact, I wish we could teach these things in schools. We have repeatedly requested the National Institute of Education to include these things in the curriculum. But, it just doesn't happen. But anyway, things are taught for exams, right? So students also don't have the opportunity of taking this to my heart. Now, for example, Sri Lanka is one of the few countries which have ratified all the major human rights treaties, 9 of them, without reservations. Reservations, when you ratify a treaty, means a state says, as a sovereign state, we accept the terms and conditions in this treaty, subject to these exceptions, right? Sri Lanka has not entered any such reservations. So that means Sri Lanka has agreed to be bound completely by these major human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, aside from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And if you look at a treaty like CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, it includes not only civil and political rights of women, but economic and social rights of women. If you look at the Rights of the Child Convention, it includes not only the autonomy rights of the child, but also economic and social rights of the child. So the list goes on. If you look at the rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Sri Lanka has ratified. That includes not only civil and political rights, but the economic and social rights of the people. So, the point here is that we have this framework, which the state is bound to respect and fulfill, right? It has to ensure these rights to the people and fulfill these rights to the people. But however, this I must say, we always, and finally, because Kumar has given a very dire warning, when I speak, I lose, trace of time. But anyway, track of time. That we shouldn't be looking only at the possibilities of justiciability of rights. We have to get economic and social rights into our constitution. That's a must. Where the National People's Power Government has, at least the president has in his manifesto, assured the public that they will do that in future constitutional reforms. And that's good. And we have to make sure that he keeps his word, but it's not only up to him to draft a constitution. It's up to us, the people, to come up with the ideas. But that we use this framework, even the existing framework in the constitution, the jurisprudence of the courts, to politically negotiate with the government. Because I think that is more important than going to courts. Going to courts is very important because we have binding, judgments and binding precedent. But I think what's important is to look at this framework like directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights when we sit across the table from government, functionaries and even economists who are quite often blind to these things. I find in my own experience, the way they even look at you, the body language, it's like, oh, you're the NGO types, right? So, we are here about serious business. We are economists, and pardon me, there may be economists here, but I think there is that hierarchy of disciplines and, and so on. But I'm sorry, economies of countries are run for people. If they have forgotten that, we have to remind them. Economies are not run in the abstract for the sake of the economy. Economies are run for the people, right? So we have to remind them of Article 3, where sovereignty lies in the people, because in Article 1, it says Sri Lanka is a democracy, right? So one, we have to get these things into the constitution, but even if we cannot get that done immediately, we have to use the existing arguments and the judgments of the court to, one, go to court and win cases, but more importantly, for political negotiations. When we make our demands, we have to refer to this framework. And let's not hear this when governments say we are in an emergency situation, things are really dire, and don't come and interrupt these things because, but we have to say things are dire for us, the people, because you misbehave and you misgovern the country. Listen to us now. And these are things that we want you to hear. You know why? Because children are dropping out of school. Malnutrition has increased. You know, I mean, you have all the statistics from international organizations. So we have to, you know, use this framework. And so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deepika. I'm sorry to have rushed you, and I hope there will be an opportunity in the discussion that follows for both panelists and one who's online to come back again and say a few more words. So let me just quickly, and she's on the screen. Kristina, you can hear us, I hope.
Yes.
We can certainly see you and we can hear you too. And thank you so much for joining us. You woke up early, you had to rush your breakfast, and but here you are. Let's look forward to hearing from you, please. I know you have a lot to say and we look forward to hearing you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Just to see, can you hear me well? Can you just quickly confirm? Yes, great. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation and being part of this very important discussion, but also having been able to listen to the brilliant presentations before. Thank you so much. I'm the political coordinator of the German CSO network Jubilee Germany, working on sovereign debt justice issues since more than a decade. And as was said already, following the case of Sri Lanka for quite a while, also because the German government has a special responsibility, being a creditor to Sri Lanka, but also being an important member of the IMF and other bodies like the G20. I was asked to speak a bit about the accountability of international financial institutions and debt restructuring in the context of international law. But maybe as a baseline for our discussion, one point to set this clear first, let's say, I think we all agree Sri Lanka's current IMF-led, creditor interest-driven sovereign debt restructuring is disastrous, right? Usually the aim of each debt restructuring must be to restore long-term debt sustainability in a way that the country get back to its feet economically and socially, right? This has not been achieved in the case of Sri Lanka, as we all know and agree. It will still be paying lots of debt service that is far beyond targets that are usually used to assess debt sustainability. Debt relief that Sri Lanka received is very minimal, and conditions, I think that was very brilliant, the way you all presented this, the conditions attached to the restructuring are and were economically and socially harmful. While the fiscal austerity often comes in because creditors are not willing to give debt relief. And actually in the case of Sri Lanka, it's very transparent in the IMF agreement, in the IMF program, that the way debt relief was calculated, it was not calculated according to what Sri Lanka actually needs to get back to its feet. It was calculated according to what creditors were willing to provide, right? And I mean, creditors want their money back, right? That's in their natural interest. And I mean, so what actually happened is that it was the citizens through austerity, but also through the domestic debt restructuring that were forced to take the higher share of the burden of the debt restructuring. And even the IMF behind closed doors, they admit what a total crap all this is, including, I mean, the program, but also its own debt sustainability targets. So just to have this set clear, before I will touch on the interlinkages of international law, accountability, debt restructuring, and austerity. By the way, what Sri Lanka experiences, this is a general trend in all debt restructurings right now, be it Ghana, be it Zambia, be it Suriname, or be it Ukraine. And not just now, right? Since decades, most restructurings were too little, came too late, which is why countries need to restructure often several times and often experience heavy social and economic losses, not because they restructure their debt, but because the restructuring is often creditor-friendly and far too insufficient for achieving the main goal of a restructuring. Anyway, one of the reasons for that, which touches on the general question of today's seminar, is that the category of sovereign debt is very unique. Unique compared to all other categories of debt, like individual debt or corporate debt, because sovereign debt has no legal framework when it comes to dealing with it in crisis. You know, in Germany, right, there's a clear insolvency law that deals with distressed debtors domestically, right? That means the right to restructure debt, ask for debt relief. This is enshrined in law and is guided by very clear principles of the rule of law. And this is not the case for sovereign debtors. A sovereign debtor faces a wild west, right, when it needs to restructure, a very chaotic pattern of different rules, different norms that are shaped by asymmetric power relations between creditors and debtor countries. Now, generally, it seems like that restructurings are very objective, right? You have very clear numbers in the IMF program, very clear targets, and it also seems like it's legally set in stone that the IMF is at the center of it all, right? I think there was absolutely no discussion whether it could be another institution, like another UN institution, right? That's going to do the debt sustainability analysis, that's going to organize the whole negotiations, right? It was always the IMF. And when you look at the program, it's all full of numbers, right? And I mean, mathematics usually are objective, right? And I can tell you no to all of this. Let me explain. First, on the IMF, the IMF has a near universal membership, and the articles of agreements of the IMF, this is an international treaty. So it is part of international public law. But nowhere in these articles of agreements, there is any article that says the IMF is the interlocutor in debt restructurings. Nowhere in the article of agreements or in any other international legal treaty, for that matter, is a condition that the IMF is the one that will undertake the debt sustainability analysis, which is at the center, right? And which is the basis for negotiating a debt restructuring. Let's make this absolutely clear. There is no legal monopoly here. Why then is it always the IMF? It only then becomes mandatory when IMF funds are involved, right? When the IMF is pouring money into countries. Why? Because the IMF, in its article of agreements, the IMF is not allowed to lend to a country when debt is unsustainable, right? So only when an IMF program is involved, then the debt sustainability analysis by the IMF is more or less mandatory. Now, if you look around, you will see all countries in debt restructurings in IMF programs. Also this, that you need an IMF program, right? That you need to go to the IMF for money. This has no legal basis too. How does this come about then, right? It is because official bilateral creditors like Germany, like the US, the so-called Paris Club, right? This is a club of creditors, bilateral creditors like Germany. They make it mandatory for a country to ask for an IMF program first before they agree to negotiate with the country. There's a very nice anecdote. Antigua and Barbuda is a very small Caribbean country, right? They wanted to invest into climate change protection. And they went to the Paris Club and said, look, can we just kind of not pay our debt, but we promise we will put this into whatever, coastal protection. The Paris Club said, we are not even going to let you through the door. We do not have an IMF program. Although Antigua didn't need any IMF program, but if you don't have one, right, you will not negotiate with us. So they make it mandatory. So by the way, that's also very interesting. And on Sri Lanka particularly, when you speak to the IMF, you will always hear, and that's something one of your colleagues, Ahilan Kadirgama, heard when he was with us in Germany, right? What he heard from one of our ministries. They said, like, look, the IMF program, that's always a government's program. It's not to us, right? Deciding what the program looks like. Not the IMF decides what the program looks like. Not the IMF is telling your government, right, to take a program. It's always a government's decision. Well, no, right? In debt restructurings, it's definitely not. So looking at the Paris Club, right? So Paris Club countries like Germany, through their condition, they make it a quasi-legal monopoly, that the IMF has this central role. What we see here, and I think that's very paramount, that is a breach of international norms, right? Because the sovereign right to restructure its debt, which is, this is breached because official creditors force a country to undergo an IMF program first. Maybe a few more words on the Paris Club from an international law point, you know. The Paris Club or bilateral creditors, they are more or less at the center of everything when it comes to defining how the debt restructuring system works. it has also absolutely no basis in international law. There is no international treaty, right, saying that the Paris Club has this role. It is just a cartel of creditors that functions on the basis of political consensus and common practice, and that's it. They also do not function after norms of international public law, right? They function according to informal principles, among them consensus, but among themselves, the consensus, solidarity. But this is about pure creditor solidarity, right? Not solidarity with citizens in the country or with the government of a debtor country, solidarity among themselves, which means, for instance, no Paris Club member is going to do a deal with the debtor country that may not be of benefit to other creditors. Information sharing is a principle, not public information sharing among themselves, right? So, and so on, there are much more principles, but there's no principle, no binding commitment to grant debt relief in an amount necessary from a human rights perspective, right? Although member countries, of course, do have duties under international human rights treaties. And what was just brilliantly said in the other presentation, right? They're also, your own government is a duty bearer, right? So, but there's no commitment to make sure that a country like Sri Lanka is able to fulfill its constitutional duties. So the natural consequence of all this and of how the Paris Club works, asset which is at the center of sovereign debt issues, the consequence is minimal consensus defined by what creditors are willing to provide, which may lead actually to a systematic violation of human rights. All right, back to the IMF and how debt restructurings currently are carried out. If in Sri Lanka or other countries, let's take the domestic debt restructuring. Nowhere in the article of agreements, it is said that the IMF can condition a domestic debt restructuring, and with that rein in sovereign domestic decisions on distributive policies, right? The mandate of the IMF is purely about questions of balance of payments, right? And I mean, when it comes to domestic debt, right? There is not really a relation with the availability of foreign currency, right? Domestic debt, if at all, has an indirect relation with that, right? But I mean, you can actually see by that kind of a domestic debt restructuring mandating this is not part of what the IMF's mandate is. Actually, the IMF publicly, right? They say they would never rein in a sovereign decision to restructure domestic debt. But we do know when looking at Sri Lanka that it clearly does on the ground, right? It was explicitly being made a condition of the program. There are scholars that argue that with some of its policies, including sometimes the draconic fiscal austerity, the IMF violates its article of agreements, right? Namely, its fundamental mission of providing temporary financing to countries, but without resorting to measures that are detrimental to national prosperity. This is even written in Article 1. Greece is actually a case in point where, for instance, the UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, they found evidence in that regard and tried to make a case, right, that the IMF violated its article of agreements. Now, generally, that no international kind of insolvency mechanism for sovereign debtor countries exists, right, similar to domestic bankruptcy laws. This is considered by many experts as one of the most serious gaps in the international financial architecture because of all the repercussions, all the impact, right, that we see right now in countries like Sri Lanka. CSOs, like my own, we globally advocate for processes that follow the rule of law and prioritize human rights over creditor rights, right, since decades. But not only CSOs. 22, for instance, it was actually a leading mind at the IMF that proposed such a legal framework, proposing it by amending the IMF's article of agreements, right? Because as an amendment of the articles, this can be made binding upon the entire membership, right? Without having to negotiate an entire new treaty. Of course, especially CSOs, right? We were very clear, this is not the best solution because the IMF is not partial, right? And of course, it has its own creditor interests. And that definitely goes against the role, right, being a judge. But this was actually partly considered, at least by this leading mind at the IMF, right, that there is a kind of conflict of interest, right, and that we need to kind of see how to establish independent organs, etc. But anyway, the proposal by the IMF in 22 was sacked and then never digged out again. 2014, we came very close to closing the gap. In the UN General Assembly, the developing country group, the G77, they proposed a multilateral legal framework for sovereign debt restructurings, which was championed by Argentina and Bolivia back then. There was a very strong opposition of the global north, right? They were saying, debt issues, this is a financial issue, this is only to be discussed in the IMF, not in the UN. And because of their strong opposition, it was actually, or they were actually succeeded that this whole process never came far. However, soft law principles were established, right, which clearly set international norms for how sovereign debt restructuring should look like. And these principles could actually be used to guide domestic courts, right? If codified domestically, they could remind courts of the big picture in a sovereign debt restructuring, also possibly mitigating biases towards, well, interpreting debt contracts in a much narrower way. But I will come back to that in a minute. Then in 2019, the UN Human Rights Council, they adopted the guiding principles on human rights impact assessments of economic reforms, right? And they encouraged governments, international financial institutions like the IMF, right, to take account of these principles when formulating and implementing economic reform policies. And one demand by CSOs with regard to Sri Lanka had been for quite a while, right, when it comes to the IMF executive directors, is that the IMF reform program should have been assessed according to these human rights impact assessments and then adapted accordingly. There's also, if we're looking at the past, a decision by the European Committee of Social Rights with a look to Greece in the 2010s that adjustment programs must avoid discriminatory or otherwise unjustified regressions of economic, social, and cultural rights. And actually, they decided that some labor market reforms adopted by Greece in the IMF program, right, violated the European Social Charter. I think it's important to note, all this is actually very useful, right, to give impetus to CSO campaigns, academic campaigns, to the political debate. In the case of Greece, it never had any material impact, right? The economic conditions have never been changed, but actually helped damaging the reputation of the IMF in that time. Now, coming to the end, and especially looking at discussions that take place right now at the global level, this is what is being discussed to make sure that restructurings won't sacrifice people's lives. In the global north, there are campaigns for establishing domestic private creditor legislation that would force private creditors to give debt relief, right? And to make it harder for them to sue countries, right? And because of that possibility that they can sue, scare countries to put people over capital. And you may all know that actually Sri Lanka has been sued in New York courts. Then there's the demand around establishing a binding registry, both in terms of creditor transparency, right? But there was also the idea of having an institution registering recalcitrant holdout bondholders, right? So that it could serve as a guide for domestic and international courts when they have to decide whether bondholders violated the international law principle of good faith in debt restructuring negotiations. Then there are different stakeholders advocating for new international independent mechanisms for debt restructuring, right? That will put human rights over debt service, right? There's the UN Conference on Trade and Development, right? They have a whole idea and concept, right? And then global civil society, the debt movement, they designed a proposal for a UN framework convention on debt with the view to kind of advocate for a very big moment next year, right? Next year, the 4th time in history, there will be a financing for development conference in Spain, right? Where kind of all countries in the world, let's say, will participate, right? And it's about financing development. And that is very high on the agenda. And there are many countries from Africa, for instance, right? Very much pushing for better rules. And there's one of this idea of a UN framework convention on debt. So then, you know, as said, this is all CSOs, etc., right? But there's also lots of countries, as said, African countries, like a whole group in the United Nations on African countries, but also individual countries like Zambia, right, that call for new rules in the sense of to limit the rights and interests of creditors, but especially to limit the rights and interests of international capital, right, at the point where it goes against fundamental human rights principles. And one duty, let's say, for global CSOs, right, for the CSO movement worldwide, is to try to make sure that global North countries cannot silence these voices, right, and make sure that that issues are discussed at the United Nations. Also to mention one thing that may be also of interest to you, there is a discussion that was encouraged by a German lawyer, namely to sue against IMF programs in countries that are strong IMF members. So for instance, to sue against an IMF program in Germany, right? Because countries like Germany, they're co-responsible for IMF programs, right? They're the ones voting for IMF programs. They're the ones voting, right, for the targets that Sri Lanka had to go through. And there are semi-annual reviews, right, where you can change, right? If you made a mistake, all right, but you can change, right? And they don't, right? They didn't. They still voted on this very disastrous program. So trying to make more visible the co-responsibility they have. And then maybe also to think about who could be allies, right? In Kenya, there are networks that work on suing the IMF per se as well, right? There's a huge lawyers network that tries to do that. Of course, there's always the question, what is the material success, right? But just to try to delegitimize these institutions more, right? And to make more visible, right? What what mistakes, let's say, these institutions do, right? For at least for this kind of political signals, these can be very promising things. And then the last 3 points when it comes to the local level. As said, there are, let's say, UN Human Rights Council guidelines, right, on foreign debt and human rights. And there is a UN independent expert on debt and human rights, right? And they kind of go to countries, right, and assess these countries or the IMF program, the debt restructuring, right, the economic reform program, and see if they are along the lines of, well, human rights commitments, right? So this could be also something to think for when it comes to Sri Lanka, to give more impetus to the debate on how illegitimate the IMF agreement is. Then you could also think about putting into law that, as the Sri Lankan government is a duty bearer, regulating by law the primacy of human rights over debt service, right? This could mean that any development project, loan agreement, but also economic reform program, right, needs to have a mandatory human rights impact assessment and would have to be terminated or renegotiated by Parliament if these assessments come to the conclusion, well, rights are harmed. And then the final idea is to operationalize by law the before mentioned principles on debt restructuring that I mentioned that were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015, right? They are called the Basic Principles on Sovereign Debt Restructuring. And Bolivia and Argentina actually did codify these domestically, right? And I mean, in contrast to what is discussed now in Sri Lanka, right, with the economic reform bill, where IMF targets shall be put into law, this would actually mean the other way around, right? Putting the UN basic principles into law, that would mean to kind of give guidance to how socially just restructurings should actually look like. And then finally, a very last word, promise. Very generally, there is a coordinated global debt movement, right? With groups on all continents that campaign and advocate against debt injustices, right? With visibility actions, political advocacy, etc. And this year in December, the Catholic Church, right, they will call out the next Jubilee year, 2025. At the end of the 1990s, it was around such a moment, right, such a Jubilee year, that global civil society was successful in actually achieving, I mean, for that moment of time at least, right, like a huge success in debt justice. And there are plans globally to use this moment of the Jubilee again to rise up all over the world to demand accountability for debt injustice. Well, maybe I will just stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristina. Please, everybody, show your... Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristina. And this is exactly what we need here in Sri Lanka. You know, this is a country that seems to have no hope, no imagination, and certainly no memory, no recollection of the past. Because the moment we are passing through, we are marking the 50th anniversary of the Rathnayaka Center for International Studies. But, you know, something else passed us by, which was the 50th anniversary of the new International Economic Order, the declaration for an NIEO. And that declaration was followed by a legal document, a legal instrument called the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, and we've forgotten. We've forgotten all of this. And it's not that we forgot it. It's not that we didn't know it in 1974 in Sri Lanka, because here in Sri Lanka, people were talking about this, were engaged in it. We had Sri Lankans abroad who were very actively involved in the process. There's going to be an event as part of this festival to remember Gamini Korea. But, and it's not only Gamini Korea, there were many other Sri Lankans, international civil servants, activists, and so on, who also put in their ideas. And come April of next year, we have the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. So these are epochal moments for peoples of the global South. But it's, and around all of those moments, around the Bandung era, around the NIEO, there were so many ideas about reform of international economic relations, about reform of the international monetary system, about a fairer, juster international system, which frankly finally is at the root of these problems. But here in Sri Lanka, I'm sorry to say, Kristina, and that's why everything you say to us, is like, it's like falling from the heavens, because it's apparently there is no life outside of an IMF agreement. There is no alternative even within an IMF agreement. We cannot have another debt sustainability analysis, because those targets and the methodology have come from God on high, apparently now having taken mortal form in Washington, D.C. So here, and of course, Sri Lanka is always the only country in the world that ever faces its own issues. There's no other country that's in a debt trap. There's no other country where there are movements who are trying to achieve debt justice. So, know nothing, learn nothing, say or do nothing. So other than what is given to us by SIA. Sorry. So now, so this is now your moment to please not just pose your questions, but also to make your observations and comments. I know we have some people online, and we will do our best to also monitor. Thank you so much. Any questions, messages, you can also unmute yourself. So please, we don't have too much time. I think we can go over a little bit because we began 10 minutes late, but we've got to get the room clear for the session that follows. So please, the floor is yours to do just quickly introduce yourself and then, yeah, fire away.
Hi, my name is Vijay Sekhar. Thank you so much for the PCS and panelists for this very rich and insightful discussion. I'm approaching this event as student of economics and public policy. And I also like to be a bit more solutions as well. Namashya, something that you mentioned was making needs to be more consultative, and there need to be checks and balances, right? So are there any sort of politics kind of question? Are there any best practices that we can learn from any previous IMF program participants who might have had better checks and balances that we seem to be having? This question is for all three panelists. Thank you.
I like to ask a question of Kristina. So it's good that you mentioned about these UN resolutions on economic reforms and human rights impact assessments. But my concern is that in international law, are these still marginal concerns, marginal factors? So are there any countries that have effectively used human rights impact assessments to challenge the sort of IMF austerity programs?
Yeah, so just to address the question on consultation, that's a really good question because I've actually been thinking about it myself. We think these laws need to be democratic, and that's why we put parliamentarians in parliament and we expect them to represent our interests. But what if it doesn't, right? So I have found that some countries do have in their constitution that when they have a lawmaking process that they have to consult people. So I think consultation might take different forms. Like for instance, Amali and I, we are involved in trying to get better microfinance regulation, right? So in doing that, we try to, this is something that the state is supposed to be doing, but Amali and a few others are actually trying to go and meet people who are directly affected by these issues and trying to consolidate what their views are on these things. So I think it has to be like a law specific thing when we decide how to build in our forums. Like sometimes it could just be, for example, if it's the EPF laws, and the tax that we brought in to make sure that the EPF participated in the debt restructuring was basically a law that said you have to participate in the debt restructuring, or otherwise we are going to give you a 30% tax. So they tried to do like give an incentive to the EPF to participate in the debt restructuring. So when they did that, for instance, clearly, okay, maybe it's domestic debt restructuring, maybe they needed to do it fast. If they're given all of those allowances, still they could give in at least, let's say, a 2-week time to maybe for people to write to them if they have any objections, to at least give them an opportunity to be heard, right? So depending on so that was a law that directly affected the people in the EPF. And in fact, in some of the cases we did, people had actually written to the EPF and asked, what are the costs and benefits of this decision? But it was not really answered. So I think it could be a broad thing where we put it in our constitution and say we ask for it. But in terms of actual mechanisms, I think it has to be very context specific. In terms of whether other IMF agreements and the laws that they've proposed, whether that had gone through, I don't know how other countries have practiced it, but that's a good question to think about. Thanks.
Well, thanks. I mean, it seems to me that, we can't discuss the legislative process and other processes just for this IMF, specific purposes. The point is we have to strengthen democratic institutions and processes in the country for everything, across the board. If we do have strong democratic systems, I think bargaining power is greater, but it all depends on how a government in office really, strategizes and uses this to win its arguments with the IMF. Now, there are some countries which have got postponements of debt repayment and, so on. So I'm not quite sure whether they've used human rights standards, but there's no doubt that at the internal level, national level, people have, and civil society has based its arguments on human rights. So I don't think you can expect the government of Sri Lanka to go and tell the IMF, people of Sri Lanka are demanding their human rights, and so therefore please go easy on us. That's a non-starter. But the point is they'll be motivated to argue in a different way, to ask for more concessions, so to speak, and go from a position of strength because the people are demanding. So those are two different but connected processes. So that's how we have to target it. And as was said by our fellow panelists, that, we also argued in the report on globalization and impact on human rights, we've got to keep talking about the primacy of human rights. Because, the whole point is about whether it's international norms or national norms, the whole purpose of these standards being there, whether it be economic standards or, why are they there? Investments, for example, international trade. Why? What is the ultimate objective? Isn't human betterment, the ultimate objective of all human endeavors? So I think we've got to be strategic about it. We've really got to be strategic. So when it comes time to discussing constitutional reform, it's really not just about the IMF. It's about how we order our national life properly to ensure that democratic institutions are strengthened and democratic processes are strengthened. But we have to go beyond that to ensure that, beyond that, I think it's about civic participation and civic strength. What has been the downfall of a lot of these things, the country, the economy, all of that, I mean, over the years has been a relative sense of civic, what's the word for it, sort of civic abdication, of apathy, I mean, very few would get involved in these issues and so on. So now I would say, aside from legislative process being consultative and all, which is absolutely a must, which was taken up during the Aragalaya also, because the youth demanded that we have a say over constitutional reform, over policy making in government. So the Janasabhas were suggested, right? But it's also about other things. When the state takes loans, when the state, there must be a transparent and consultative process so we know for what purposes our state takes these huge loans. So let's say there was I'm sorry, I'm taking a bit of time. For example, if we knew loans were taken to build conference halls in Hambantota, for various types of things that didn't bring in the sort of returns, surely if that level of scrutiny was there, we wouldn't have gotten into this huge debt trap. I'm sure there would have been a debt trap, but this, really became very low. So I think we have to think a little bit more broadly than merely dealing with the IMF.
Thank you so much, Deepika. Kristina, there was a question which was specific to you, and this is a challenge always thrown at us here, right? I'm sure not only here by the mainstream, and where else in the world has this happened? There's no, give us your counter example of where it's possible to do things outside of this framework. So please.
Yeah. Maybe first to come also very quickly back on this question about more checks and balances, right? And more consultative rights, just to point you to one issue there in June. I think this was mentioned before, right? There was like when I was also in Sri Lanka, there was a consultation with eminent economic academics, among them Professor Martin Guzman, who used to be the finance minister of Argentina, and they wrote an open letter, I think to parliamentarians, but it's public, right? It is in one of your newspapers, and you can Google it, where they also made some suggestions, right, about how, especially on an IMF program, right, checks and balances could be improved. Among them, right, to make sure there is parliamentary approval of an IMF program necessary. And Emisa Tegal and Ahilan Kadirgama, they also wrote a very good paper on different. So I'm just saying there are already also some ideas out there that definitely make sense to revisit. And then on the question, first, actually, whether with human right impact assessments, right, it was ever tried to challenge an IMF program, let's say, or effectively used, let's say not by governments, right? So it's not that any government that entered into an IMF program actually did that, right? Because usually when a government goes to the IMF, right, it's absolutely desperate, right? And it is being told. And I mean, this is the kind of idea, right, that everyone has, right? If you are not following the IMF, right, and the recipe of the program, you will not get any money from kind of no capital market access in the future, right? No one else is going to talk to you anymore, or these kind of ideas that people have. So usually governments try, and I mean, this also includes the Sri Lankan government back then, right, tries to stick to kind of the dot of the IMF program. So we don't know of any government in an IMF program, right, that used an human right impact assessment to challenge the program, but it has been used and brought in by other eminent persons, let's say, including the UN independent experts in Greece, right? It was a very strong campaign, which actually, as said, led to delegitimizing the IMF in a way when it comes to Europe. It then actually, this whole discussion, it influenced the discussion at the IMF on social protection, right? There is a huge discussion on, I don't know, I mean, it's not the role of the IMF, right? That's very clear, right? The IMF actually does not understand itself as a development institution, but there is a huge discussion on social protection, right? And I mean, we are super critical of the way in IMF programs targeted social assistance is being pushed for. But let's say that it is in there, right? That they actually think about that they need to take out of whatever austerity, right, they do. at least a portion when it comes to social protection, and they even discuss social protection floors. That is all inspired by this whole discussion about, and this whole successful campaigns in a way, right, that fiscal austerity is harmful. But there's always a very huge break between the policy discussion and the policy level at the IMF, and then the operational level, I mean, the country level, right? Then the program is being designed, and we see, like in Sri Lanka, right, you still have this draconic austerity. So there's still lots of work to be done in that case, right? But in that sense, right, there was a bit of an effect of all these discussions and all these, especially showing at concrete cases, right, how IMF programs violate human rights. But then on countries, Grenada is actually an example where it was not that the IMF program was entirely kind of, I mean, that Grenada walked out of the IMF program and just did their own program, but they actually managed, I mean, there was a very good cooperation between the church, right, and the government, and they managed to soften the program, which is still, I mean, not enough, definitely, but they managed to soften it. And then, I mean, one very good example is Argentina, which actually managed to walk out of the IMF program, right, and still restructure with its bondholders. And that's also one of these fears, right? I mean, Argentina is, of course, a different caliber, right? A much bigger country. But I think when it comes to Sri Lanka, right, there's always this argument, well, if you walk out of the IMF program, I think it was also given or renegotiate, right? In your case, also just renegotiating it. I think there's always this, well, you will never get any money, right, from capital market actors. I mean, the question in Sri Lanka is, would that actually be so bad? So that's maybe also part of the discussion to think about. But as I said, Argentina actually walked out of the IMF program, but was still able to restructure at least part of its debt. And then two final examples. I think it makes sense, although it's a bit, I mean, pretty different, a different context, right? And it was not so much about the actual conditions and human rights impacts, but Iceland in Europe is actually also a case in point during the Euro crisis, right? When they decided a different path. I mean, they were able to decide on a different path, right? But it actually shows very clearly and very good that it was better for the country. And then finally, there are cases in history where there was a totally different path, right? Where it was not an IMF DSA, right? Where it was even an independent mediator being, I mean, and not creditors actually saying this is what you get, but actually an independent mediator saying this is what you need to give. There are countries, for instance, like Indonesia in 1969, right? Where it was absolutely successful, right? It was, I mean, I think they didn't have a crisis 30 years from then. And I mean, but these are kind of lost memories, right? And I mean, if there's interest, we can share all the materials on these different cases just for kind of furthering the debate in the country.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristina. So we don't have too much time, and we've now got questions flooding in on the chat. And I know there'll be people in the room who also want to ask them. So this is going to be the final round. So we look very quickly. We've got three questions. I'm sure three big ones. Namashya, I'm going to ask you to address the first one, please. What is the mechanism or room available for us to reverse the decision taken on EPF, as it is already passed at Parliament, in Parliament? The second question, y'all can decide, or maybe we can ask Melanie to come in on this. If a panelist could comment on the idea of, quote, debt for climate swaps. Are debt for climate swaps a solution, a false solution, or one more debt trap? Asks Lakpriya. No doubt somewhere in the Eastern Seaboard. And then we have Senil Senivaratna. Oh my gosh, Senil. Okay, this question is directed to all three panelists. Institutions like the Paris Club often treat support for economically challenged nations as an investment, balancing concerns such as preventing a domino effect with ensuring a return. Okay, this creates of the people and the priorities of international financial bodies. While our Supreme Court has extended the public trust doctrine to areas like environmental protection, procurement, and presidential pardons, it remains conservative in economic matters. Perhaps Professor Udagama can come in on this. Given these limits, does the Constitution permit the court to act more assertively on economic issues within its mandate, including matters involving contracts between states and entities like the IMF, or is it bound by a conservative textual interpretation? How can the court navigate these competing interests effectively? Shall we, 3 questions, so please. Yes.
So on the EPF, what the parliament actually did was it passed the presentation of the government was presented to parliament, and it passed it by way of a resolution. So it wasn't really a law to begin with. It was a way to give it legitimacy. They hadn't discussed this with people. It was a very sudden decision. So they put it in parliament and they passed it by way of a resolution. So we don't have the barriers that we had with an actually passed law with the decision of domestic debt restructuring. That's the first, on a first level, there is no issue there. But secondly, also the way that we went about it is that we basically renegotiated, we redid the offer where we exchanged old bonds for a new bond. We basically passed regulations to do that, where the old treasury bonds were exchanged for newer bonds with different financial terms. So like that was suggested by Kristina, where we can renegotiate the IMF agreement, we can also redo that and just do another regulation where we offer a different exchange with better financial terms for the EPF, if we are going to do it at all, or we renegotiate that to how it originally was. So I don't think it's something that's hard to do, but the door on court might be closed because we tried, but this is something that we can engage with in terms of our conversations with the political branches, with those values that are already in the Constitution that was explained.
Ask Kristina to come in on the debt for climate swaps, and Melanie, please also jump in. But let's hear from Kristina first, please.
Yeah, if I just may, sorry, very quickly on this first one on DDR, just to repeat again, right? And just for thinking about arguments, again, that the IMF does not have a mandate, right? It's not part of its mandate to make it mandatory, the domestic debt restructuring, and it's absolutely transparent in the public realm that they did, that they forced it, right? And again, about thinking about, just because it's a festival of ideas, right? So it actually has a paper saying itself that it is not allowed to rein into these decisions, and that DDRs should be made decisions on DDRs should be made very carefully, right? That's written in an IMF paper. So thinking about arguments, right? And maybe actually trying to hold the IMF itself, right? And members like Germany to account on that. And then maybe also thinking about the court, I think that's the third question. And then I promise I come to the climate swaps issue. Again, that there are these kind of, in the public, in the kind of public law sphere, just remembering again that there are these basic principles on sovereign debt restructuring out there, right? That has been adopted by member states of the UN, and that courts can actually use that, right? To guide assessments and then decisions, even if they don't have directly a kind of material impact on the IMF as an international body, right? But kind of putting out a decision on this basis, right, that the program or certain conditions, like in Greece, right, it was on labor market reforms, that was part of the IMF program, right, to kind of bring out into the realm that these are not according to such principles. And then on the swaps, it's first of all, a very good tool, right? Swaps are a very good innovative financing tool. They are no tool to actually restructure or make debt sustainable, not at all. They are usually very small, they take a long time. There are something, right, that is, good to have, right? It's an innovative idea to create more and more finance, but that's it. And what we see right now in the political discourse, that's something that we observe in the past 20 to 30 years of sovereign debt discussions in the global sphere. That is that swaps, which are very, it's technical, it's comfortable, right? You can actually avoid all these discussions like what happens in Sri Lanka and who's actually responsible for what happens in Sri Lanka, right? And then what happens in Sri Lanka is actually part of a dysfunctional system. You can avoid all these discussions when you focus on debt swaps, right? So when it comes to Sri Lanka, I would very much recommend, right? Because I mean, we know the discussions when it comes to our own government or when it comes to the IMF and all these kind of bodies, right? And they use, as I said, they use kind of, let's talk about swaps and that's it, right? To distract from, we also need reforms in the other areas of the system. So when it comes to Sri Lanka has a debt sustainability problem, right? It needs debt relief, and it needs heavy debt relief, and it needs debt relief that actually makes creditors like bondholders, etc., pay for what they, in a way, did. And with swaps, you don't, right? With swaps, you actually, apologies, the swaps kind of distract this discussion, right? So, but when it comes to countries that are not in a debt crisis, right, that may actually still have a sustainable debt situation, right, but actually would like to increase fiscal space, then swaps may be actually a very good tool. And then it depends on what swaps, right? Right now, there's lots of discussions about actually private investors, right, that they design swaps. And there's a very good publication, an empirical analysis of the first kind of new private sector investor swap models, which shows that there are lots of threats and risk, right? And that they're actually very expensive and not very useful, right? So, and then there are ideas about, okay, what could be criteria, right, to make them better. Very happy also to share this, but so that it depends also on design, but just as in a summary, right, generally it is used politically as a distraction from the more structural reforms that are needed.
Can we just hear from Melanie, and then I'll come to Professor Udagama.
Yeah, thanks, Kumar. And yeah, I completely agree with what Kristina said about how debt swaps is actually used only as a tool, and especially looking at it from a climate justice perspective, which suggests that the solutions to climate change has to be fair, just, equitable, and also self-determined by the people, especially the locals and the countries. So that's why we have even for like Paris Agreement, the targets that we set are nationally determined contributions. So the countries decide how can we contribute depending on how much we contribute to climate change in a global level and how much we are victims of the pollution created by the big emitter richer countries and also the private organizations. So if you take most of the creditor companies also, they are the investors in fossil fuel industry or the polluting industries. So the debt swaps, like Kristina clearly said, it creates this out of sight, out of mind sort of a mechanism where you swap this off and you completely forget about the accountability. So yes, I would say it is a false solution, but there's also a movement that suggests that debt for Global South should be completely cancelled based on the climate change, take in consideration how these richer countries and the financial organizations are the ones responsible for climate crisis that poorer countries in Global South like Sri Lanka faces.
Please, Professor Udagama, the question on the courts.
Yeah, on the courts. Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think we need a bit of time to reflect on that. But what I can say is looking at the trajectory of judgments on public law over the past few decades, is that the court has gradually been losing that conservatism. It's, it's whittling down that conservative approach to looking at public issues. So if I don't think this is a proper analogy. Now, let's say, for example, 4 decades ago, the court was extremely conservative on reviewing emergency powers. Very deferential to the executive, but the court witnessed. I mean, after all, courts don't function in isolation. It sees what happens around, observes the political context, and the judiciary observed how emergency powers continue to be were abused, continuously, I would say, for decades. The court changed and started to review everything, except the declaration of a state of emergency. It still has not, so we'll see how the court, I think there's a case pending. So we'll see how the court comes out on that. Now on economic matters, yes, I mean, I would say that there has been a traditional conservatism, but we see certain tears in that as well, in the sense, for example, when the case went up before the petition, challenging the acts of members of the executive, who the petitioner said were responsible for the economic crisis. The court gave an extremely expansive judgment. On the part of the state, the argument was that it's parliament that is finally the arbiter, and the supervisor of public financial matters and so on. Court has no role to play. The court rejected all of that and pointed out that, especially when it comes to executive discretion, central bank, all the other governmental authorities, including public representatives who are members of the public. So you see the president, the former prime minister, all these officials being held responsible, said, no, court has a role to play. And they found these officials to be in violation, again, of public trust. And that's where they brought in also the directive principles of state policy and said, by the arbitrary actions that they've taken, the decisions, that they violated the rights of the people. So I have a feeling if governments continue to have this abusive trajectory by entering into various types of agreements internationally, whereby people are, shortchanged, I have a feeling the court's conservatism will completely, dissolve. So we've seen signs of that. So I'm optimistic. So it's only a question, again, we have very clever lawyers here who, draft and craft these petitions and give arguments, present arguments. And I think the court has been really good in the past few years, wouldn't you say? It's been the only savior. I mean, we couldn't rely on the executive, certainly not that was a problem. We couldn't rely on the legislature. So I think we have to keep emphasizing the importance of the court as the final keeper of the Constitution, the protector of the Constitution. I'm optimistic.
Let's hear from a crafty, clever litigator.
I don't want to have the last word on this. I mean, I'm glad that there's optimism. I think, being on the front lines a little bit kind of erodes that optimism. But I do think there is a lot more in terms of the technicalities also that court also needs to grapple with, and that understanding. And after the fact has been fairly easy for court to see and then also side with the people in that frustration to say economic crisis. Yes, there are people that were responsible. But I think to be a bit more proactive in terms of preventing something that happens, we haven't really seen that, because there is that, there's that fear that strikes everybody, I think. And I think Namashya's presentation had that, about this idea that we are worried because we are all not economists then, lawyers included, that we may not have the answers to prevent what, or something that we say or do will cause further loss. So I think that also bears down on the courts, right? And we need to move away from that. We need to avail ourselves of that technical expertise from different disciplines, not just economists, in coming to those decisions. And I think we are very slow still as the judiciary to rely on that, except on the word of lawyers right now, but to be able to draw in that expertise when necessary and then also take decisions.
Thank you, Hamza. So with your permission, then I'll just close by thanking. First, let's have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Kristina, thank you so much. Deepika, Udagama, Namashya, Rathnayaka, thank you to all of you for coming and being here with us. It made a big difference to have a room that wasn't empty. Thank you, everybody who joined us online. There were 12 of you, and you stayed online, God knows what time zones. Remember, this is not the only event which is on this thematic of debt or sort of justice in terms of the international system. So please look at the Festival of Ideas program, because as you know, every Friday, bar the Friday after the election, there's a full day of program of events here. So please do also come for those and encourage your friends to do the same. Thank you very much. Keep in touch. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Very big thank you. This is Tanisha. Thank you, Tanisha. Thank you, Tanisha. Thank you.